Today, I want to share with you the fascinating story of a very interesting ship, the light aircraft carrier USS Saipan. Although I'm not an expert in operational actions on aircraft carrier decks, I have always been captivated by their history and design. And today, we will delve into the past of the USS Saipan. Its own combat history is not very extensive, but this only allows us to uncover the broader context of its creation and how it influenced the development of the American fleet. So what exactly was the USS Saipan? It was a light aircraft carrier, designed and built during the final stage of the Second World War. It did not participate in combat operations as it was launched only in 1945. But it is important to understand what laid the foundation for the emergence of such light aircraft carriers, which the United States built at the end of the war. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, it became absolutely clear. Future naval battles would be decided not by battleships, but by the power of carrier battle groups and their deck aviation. Although the United States, like Japan, had aircraft carriers, American command always sought superiority. A strategic decision was made to significantly expand the aircraft carrier fleet, especially through a large number of light aircraft carriers. Among the first such converted ships were the Independence-class aircraft carriers. Few people know that they were converted from the hulls of Cleveland-class light cruisers. At that time, a huge number of cruisers had been laid down, and in late 1941, before the official entry of the United States into the war with Japan, President Franklin Roosevelt proposed the idea of converting several Cleveland-class cruisers into aircraft carriers. This was due to the fact that the large Essex-class strike aircraft carriers, although planned for construction, were only expected to be ready by 1944. At the time, no one had any idea of the scale of the impending war. However, as soon as the war began, the production pace of the Essexes was immediately accelerated. The first ship of this class, the USS Essex, entered service as early as December 1942. Concurrently, in January 1942, the decision to convert the Clevelands was finally made. Thus, a certain number of Independence-class aircraft carriers were built. But it should be understood that as conversions of already laid-down light cruisers, they had limited capabilities. Their air group was small, which became a critical drawback for conducting full-scale naval operations. Therefore, based on the experience of building the Independences, a new proposal was put forward by mid-1943 to build aircraft carriers that would be laid down as aircraft carriers from the very beginning, but again utilizing the foundations of existing cruiser designs. For this, the hull lines, the internal arrangement of boiler and engine rooms, and key bulkheads from the Baltimore-class heavy cruiser were taken as a basis. This was a very successful idea that allowed for accelerated design and construction. The Saipan-class light aircraft carriers were designed based on the Baltimore-class cruisers. Initially, as many as 18 such ships were planned for construction, but ultimately it was limited to only 2. Certain requirements were set for them. They had to be faster, more capacious, and have a strengthened deck to be capable of accommodating aircraft weighing 9 metric tons or approximately 20,000 pounds. And, as it later turned out, this was done for good reason. However, there was no longer space on their decks for 5-inch or 127mm guns, which were standard armament on most later American ships. Everything was limited to only Bofors and Oerlikon anti-aircraft mounts. Given that the project was approved only in early 1943 to 1944, the 2 ships, the lead ship, USS Saipan, and the second, USS Wright, were laid down already in mid-1944. Both of these aircraft carriers were launched in 1945. USS Saipan on July 8, 1945, and USS Wright on September 1, 1945, literally just a day before the official end of World War II. They were commissioned, of course, much later, in 1946 and 1947 respectively. Each of these ships spent nearly 30 years in service, but we will definitely talk more about their service in detail later. And yet, I would like to briefly tell you what Saipan was named after, because, even for me, as someone interested in history, the first association with the word Saipan is, of course, an aircraft carrier. This ship, despite not having participated in World War II combat, perfectly fit the concept of further development of light aircraft carriers. Although, to be fair, it should be noted that Essex-class aircraft carriers had already been laid down before it, which were later modernized and could already accommodate jet aircraft. So let's return to Saipan. In the American Navy, there was a long-standing tradition of naming ships after something. For example, battleships received names of states such as USS Montana or USS Iowa. Cruisers were often named after cities. Let's recall USS Pensacola or USS Cleveland. But for aircraft carriers, there was no such clear tradition. Some names were symbolic, like USS Independence, named in honor of independence. Others were named in honor of significant battles, such as USS Midway, dedicated to the Battle of Midway, or our USS Saipan, named in honor of the Battle of Saipan Island. To be precise, it was the Battle of Saipan Island. And what kind of island was it? Saipan came under Japanese control after World War I. Many interesting things are connected with this island. First, it was a Spanish colony, then a German one, until Japan occupied it in 1914. Before the start of World War II, Saipan was considered the outermost frontier of Japanese defense, one of the most important strategic points. It was an island lost somewhere in the ocean, located far from large archipelagos like the Philippines. Many have heard the name, but few imagine exactly where it is located. A significant civilian population lived on the island, from 25,000 to 30,000 Japanese. When American forces began their victorious offensive, which lasted almost the entire final period of the war, and it was decided to take Saipan in mid-1944, this created an extremely unfavorable situation for the Japanese. Simply put, Saipan could not be lost. It was a key, the last frontier, and if Saipan fell, it would mean, well, practically the end. And why? I will tell you now. It is also worth noting that a few months before the Americans began to capture Saipan, Emperor Hirohito ordered all civilian residents of the island to commit seppuku, or otherwise take their own lives. Moreover, if they did so, their spiritual status would be equated with that of warriors who fell in battle. And this, of course, was considered extremely honorable. Why did he give such an order? In fact, if the population of Saipan had seen what the Americans were doing, and Americans, it must be said, treated the Japanese and civilians in general quite normally. And this was already known at that time. If the indigenous population of Japan, and there were not just Filipinos or someone else, there were specifically Japanese people there, had seen that Americans were not as depicted by Japanese propaganda. Of course, there were isolated cases of cruelty, as happens in any war, and excesses did occur, but the overall picture was different. That is why no civilians were supposed to survive, lest they see that the Americans were not so bad after all. Consequently, a huge number of civilians were destroyed, a significant portion of whom were annihilated by the Japanese army itself. Many wounded in hospitals were finished off. This, of course, is a separate, horrifying page in Saipan's history. Truly terrible things happened there. When the Battle of Saipan began, it lasted 3 weeks and 3 days, from June 15th to July 9th, 1944. One could say that a unique anniversary of this event recently passed. 32,000 Japanese soldiers were on the island. They were attacked by an American force roughly twice their size. And of course, there were ships shelling the island. A photograph even survived of the cruiser Indianapolis, which shelled Saipan, along with a vast number of other ships. Over these 3 weeks and 3 days, the entire Japanese force was completely annihilated. Of the 32,000 soldiers, 24,000 died, with about 5,000 committing suicide in various ways. There is even a mountain called Banzai Cliff, the Banzai Cliff, from which Japanese soldiers shouting "Banzai" jumped, crashing against the rocks. Truly savage things occurred there, thousands shot, thousands killed. And it must be noted that civilian casualties on Saipan were also immense. The vast majority of people hid in the jungles, and it was practically impossible to distinguish between the hiding places of Japanese partisans or soldiers and those of peaceful inhabitants. Everything was burned with napalm. Americans, by the way, later burned many other things with napalm. But overall, civilian losses were simply colossal. Imagine, of 32,000 men, only 921 were captured. This means that all others died in battle or went missing. Escaping the islands was practically impossible. A very important detail is that during the battles for Saipan, the commander of the defense, Japanese Lieutenant General Saito, died. Also killed were 2 very famous admirals, Nagumo and Takagi, each of whom at different times commanded large fleet formations. Admiral Nagumo, for example, commanded the main carrier group during the attack on Pearl Harbor. These admirals were sent to Saipan for various reasons and unfortunately died after the island was lost. With the loss of Saipan, the Americans gained an extremely important foothold. Now B-29 bombers could easily take off, as Saipan is located only 1,300 miles from the main territory of Japan, allowing them to bomb it directly, as well as attack the Philippines. The Japanese, of course, also tried to bomb Saipan. But once Iwo Jima and Okinawa fell in the spring of 1945, Japanese aircraft could no longer reach Saipan, and the Americans no longer had to worry about air raids. That is why Saipan is an extremely important key location. Even after its loss, Japan's Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned. As this defeat was indeed a major blow, though, considering the American successes, it could have been expected. But let us return to our own Saipan, the aircraft carrier USS Saipan, CVL-48. It, so to speak, did not serve long under this name in its initial role. Squadron VF-103, which had various designations and still exists, was based on it. It was the first deck squadron to use FH-1 Phantom jet aircraft, specifically from the aircraft carrier Saipan. And in fact, it was the ship's small size and its inability in the future to accommodate more advanced jet aircraft that determined its entire subsequent fate, as it was not designed for such large and heavy machines. His career, until approximately the mid-1950s, was quite diverse. He primarily served as a training aircraft carrier, undertaking rescue missions, notably off the coast of Greenland, although his assistance there was insubstantial. He also spent time in the Mediterranean Sea, assisting the U.S. Sixth Fleet, participated in various exercises in the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, and translated the Panama Canal. He was off the Korean coast during the Korean War, where he also participated, but as a support aircraft carrier, spending a considerable amount of time there. He was also near Japan, as significant U.S. Navy forces were stationed there after the war, and this continues to this day. And incidentally, he even supported French forces during the First Indochina War. Following all these events, he departed from the Korean coast, passed through the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean, returning to America on July 20th, 1954, completing a full circumnavigation of the globe. He did not remain in America for long, after which he participated in the aftermath of Hurricane Hazel, which caused damage to many islands and coastal areas, providing assistance with evacuation and cargo delivery. Ultimately, USS Saipan was decommissioned in 1957 after serving for about 10 years. Initially, there were plans to rebuild this aircraft carrier in the same manner as the Essex-class carriers, adding an angled flight deck. However, this idea was abandoned because he was still too small for such a modernization. Instead, it was decided to convert this ship into something else, just like its sister ship USS Wright, and some other aircraft carriers, such as the Commencement Bay-class escort carriers. So what was Saipan eventually converted into? When it comes to aircraft carriers, we are accustomed to imagining them in their original role, as giant floating air bases with enormous flight decks and spacious hangars. That is what USS Saipan initially was, a light aircraft carrier. Initially, there was an idea to convert him into a command ship, a floating command post, to relieve some of the burden on other fleet vessels. But in the end, USS Saipan did not become a command ship in that form. Instead, he was converted into a floating communications relay ship, receiving the designation AGMR-2 and renamed USS Arlington. It was under this name in 1966 that he entered service with the United States Navy. To accomplish this task, a vast amount of diverse equipment was installed on board. These included numerous high-frequency and low-frequency transmitters, approximately 50 or even more units, as well as a massive array of antennas, including significant 2.4-meter antennas. USS Arlington was transformed into a veritable floating radio tower, capable of transmitting and relaying messages over immense distances. This was of colossal importance during the Vietnam War, as Arlington provided vital communication and message transmission between shore and sea, coordinating military operations. For his service in Vietnam, the ship was awarded 7 battle stars, a considerable number for a vessel that performed exclusively communications functions. His service in Vietnam was not filled with dynamic combat engagements. It involved maintaining position for certain periods, providing communications, and then returning for rotation. Thus, he performed his duties until approximately 1968. But how else can a ship equipped with powerful antennas capable of coordinating the actions of a large group of vessels be used? It can be employed in search and rescue operations. Indeed, in late 1968 or early 1969, as the Apollo space program was actively pursuing a moon landing, the USS Arlington, formerly Saipan, played an important role. It participated in the recovery of space capsules that splashed down somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Specifically, the Arlington took part in supporting the Apollo 11 mission, the very one that delivered the first humans to the moon. Interesting fact, the day before the capsule with the crew was recovered, President Richard Nixon himself was on the deck of the Arlington to greet the astronauts. Of course, all good things come to an end. Considering that the aircraft carrier had been launched quite a long time ago, and after all these reconfigurations, its equipment was also gradually becoming obsolete. In 1970, the ship was decommissioned from the fleet. Although its conversion into a relay vessel took several years, it served as AGMR-2 for only 4 years. In 1976, the Arlington was sold for scrap. Such is the interesting fate, in my opinion, of this ship. It avoided participation in one war but actively engaged in 2 others, changed its designation from an aircraft carrier to a unique communications vessel, and even helped fish out astronauts from the boundless expanse of the ocean. This is truly an amazing story of one of the ships, demonstrating the versatility of naval technology and its adaptation to new challenges. It is precisely these kinds of stories that captivate me in the world of aviation and the fleet. Let us now consider this aircraft carrier's air wing. Its air wing can have several configurations. One variant includes 3 fighters, 1 bomber, and 2 torpedo bombers. This is a fairly typical balanced scheme that allows for both air defense and strike missions. But the real interest lies in the unique composition of its squadron. Although there are only 3 fighters in the initial configuration, the number of bombers is striking. There are as many as 8. Even more importantly, thanks to certain modernizations or crew training, the number of bombers can increase to 9 and fighters to 4. 9 bombers is almost 1.5 full squadrons of a typical American aircraft carrier, and it is even more than 2 squadrons of a Japanese aircraft carrier, not counting specialized reinforcements. Thanks to such power, the Saipan can launch up to 12 aircraft simultaneously, forming 2 full combat squadrons. It is worth noting that all Saipan aircraft, fighters, torpedo bombers, and bombers alike, are Level 9 aircraft, which endows them with exceptional performance and survivability. The bombers carry 1,000-pound bombs capable of inflicting significant damage. Their durability level fully corresponds to this high class. There is also a second air wing configuration, but according to observations, it is less effective. It focuses on torpedo bombers, allowing up to 6 such aircraft to be launched simultaneously. This constitutes 1 full squadron of torpedo bombers. However, this option does not provide the same flexibility and striking power as the primary configuration. That is why most prefer the first, more versatile air wing scheme. My goal was to share this story with you, as I myself was very interested to learn more about this unique ship. That is all for today. I hope you found it interesting to learn more about the aircraft carrier Saipan. If you wish to deepen your knowledge, I am confident you will find much information about it in other sources. Until next time.